Newly established National Council of Gender-Based Violence and Femicide has made the case for urgently prioritizing gender-based violence in the country. Sibongile Ndashe, who's the Executive Director of the Initiative for Strategic Litigation in Africa, joins me now to give her views on the proposed role of the Council. A pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon, Sibongile. Firstly, let's begin by getting your initial reaction to the signing of this particular act. What do you make of it?
Hi, I'm sorry, there's just a lot of background noise, and I hope that you'll be able to hear me. It's really unfortunate that 2 weeks before the elections, the president signed the bill in its current form. This bill was first published around 2021, and there were a lot of consultations and a lot of submissions were made to say that this framework that has been created in this bill is not going to give us the council that we want, or the leadership, accountability, and coordination that civil society and other stakeholders have asked for since 2018. So the bill has been signed, but a lot of work needs to go into amending this bill because it should never have been passed in its current state. So that's my initial reaction, and we can go on to what's really wrong with this bill.
So let's get into that. I mean, the Act establishes a national council which is tasked with coordinating efforts to combat gender-based violence as well as femicide. How do you envision the council's role in really addressing these critical issues?
So one of the things that have been a problem in responding to gender-based violence has been the lack of coordination, the lack of senior leadership from government being in charge of the response. This came out very clearly in the 24 demands from the 24 demands of the total shutdowns in 2018, and it is there in the National Strategic Plan. So what we needed to see in this legislation was a legislative framework that tells us that the Interministerial Committee is basically an obligation of the state that they needed to convene this. This is not in the legislation. A very big thing has been around the resourcing of the response. There is no fund that has been created in the legislation. In 2022, the president set up, with the assistance of the private sector, an interim fund, which is a private sector-led fund. But at all times, it had always been known that a fund that is led by the state was going to be created. The legislation establishing the council fails to create this fund. So we are still left with an unclear position as to how government intends to resource the response. The third thing has been the issue of intergovernmental coordination, so that people stop being moved from pillar to post when Department of Health says, you need to get Department of Justice to do this or Department of Women to do this. The National Strategic Plan establishes an ministerial committee. But one of the key things in this legislation is that this is a legislation of national competence. We have always said that we needed to create obligations for provinces as well as for municipalities. And this is all absent in this legislation. So this was a tick box thing before the election. So let's stop playing games. Let's go back and amend this legislation so that it has the teeth that we need it to have in order to be able to do the work that it wants to do. Right now, it's just another body where people will be elbowing each other for positions, but it really doesn't have what it is needed in order to lead the response.
Sibongile, as we wrap up our conversation, the Act does not explicitly address online gender-based violence. How significant do you think this oversight is, and what measures should be taken to include OGBV in the Council's agenda?
I mean, I think there has been other ways in which online violence has been, and this is not the only thing. We've got the Sexual Offences Act that deals with sexual offences. We've got other pieces of legislation, so it's not fatal that online gender-based violence is not addressed in this legislation, because the courts There have been a way of actually expanding our current legislative framework to recognize online gender-based violence. Yes, we do need to have something explicit, but this is not the legislation to do that, to recognize different forms of violence. It does say it deals with gender-based violence, but this is about setting up a framework, the institutional framework for responding to gender-based violence, and the council is just but one of those things.
Thank you so much for your time. That's Sibongile Ndashe, really sharing her insights on the newly established National Council of Gender-Based Violence and Femicide, but also looking at the urgent need for prioritizing the GBV plight in the country.